So now we created our first website and we now know how to create HTML pages, and we wrote our first piece of HTML code. But the approach we've been using thus far has a flaw. Whilst using a text editor like this TextEdit app on macOS or Notepad on Windows works for such a very basic HTML file, for such a basic web page, we'll definitely face some issues if we work on bigger projects, on bigger websites with more content and with more code. If we have a look at a page like Amazon.com, then we can get some doubts if this is the best approach. If you go to Amazon.com and you right-click in there to view the page source, right-click here on a non-image, for example. If we click here and view the page source, wow, that's a lot of source code. And if you imagine writing code like this in this length and this complexity in an editor like this, that doesn't sound like fun. It's easy to mistype, to, for example, forget such a slash, a forward slash, which then renders this an invalid element. And therefore, you don't want to do that. You don't want to use a text editor like this. Instead, you want to use an editor which brings more features, which was built for development, for programming, possibly which was built for web development specifically. Because it turns out that there exist specific editors for development which allow us to edit plain text files, which a HTML file still is in the end, but which still give us more support, more convenience. For example, by highlighting certain language features, by highlighting these H1 tags, for example, by highlighting potential errors we might be making, and by giving us a lot of other assistance and functionality that simply makes working with code like this easier, and that makes it easier for us to spot errors and to write correct code. And such editors exist, and best of all, one of the most popular and best editors out there is available completely for free. So it is an extra piece of software which we want to install, but it's free, and it's available for all operating systems. Now, which editor is this? It's an editor called Visual Studio Code. And that's important. There also is an editor called just Visual Studio, and both are from Microsoft. But Visual Studio is not primarily focused on web development. Instead, you would typically use it for other programming languages. So therefore, it's not Visual Studio which you want to use, but Visual Studio Code. And this is available for free, as I mentioned. If you visit code.visualstudio.com, or if you just Google for Visual Studio Code and you visit the website there, you can download it for various operating systems. Your operating system should be pre-selected here by default. And you can simply download it and then install it on your system. Now, once this download finished, you can click on it to, in my case here on macOS, unzip this folder which I download, and then drag this Visual Studio Code app file into the applications folder. On Windows, you can download an installer from code.visualstudio.com. So that's what I'll do here. So let's wait for this download to finish here, which can take a couple of seconds or minutes depending on your internet speed. Now the download did finish for me here, so I'll start this installer here on Windows. And the installation process is really straightforward. We accept the agreement, and then you can basically confirm all these defaults. Of course, you can also install it into another folder though if you want to. So here I switched to a different folder on a different partition. Click Next, and Next. Here you can also keep all the defaults, and then click Install. Now the installation can also take a short while, and I'll be back once it finished. And once it did finish, You can keep this checked and start Visual Studio Code. You can of course also start it on macOS. Now once you start it, you should see a starting screen, a welcome screen, that looks something like this. The exact look can differ over time, but it should look something like this. Now here you can learn more about Visual Studio Code and how you can tweak it, and definitely feel free to play around with that. We will also do that later in a couple of minutes. For the moment, I just want to open and edit that file that we created. For this, we could click Open File here, or go to File, Open File, or on macOS, just Open. On macOS, this option is just called Open instead of Open File. Here it is Open File though, so I'll choose this. And then we can navigate to this folder in which we added our index.html file and select that file and open it. Now once you selected this file and clicked open, you might see a trust warning like this. This is a feature built into Visual Studio Code which tries to warn you that you're not opening and editing and possibly executing files where you don't understand the code. Here, of course, it's our own file, so we do trust it, so we can click Open here. And then you should see the code that's stored in this file here inside of Visual Studio Code. And you see that it already looks a bit different compared to what we had before in this plain text editor. The HTML tag, for example, this H1 tag here, is blue in my case. It has a different color than the text between the tags. And it's color coding, syntax highlighting as it's called, like this, that helps with programming. Here, of course, we have a simple file with just one line of code, but if you had bigger files with more code in them, as we will have them throughout this course, or if you're working with multiple files, tools like Visual Studio Code make working with that much easier. For example, it will be much easier to see where your HTML tags are, the blue things here, and where the content between the tags is, because they have different colors. So that's pretty nice to have. Now, you can open and edit single files like this, but it's even better if you open the entire project folder instead of a single file with Visual Studio Code. Because throughout this course section, we're going to add multiple code files to our project. For example, we'll have separate files for CSS code at some point, and we want to manage them all in the same project and conveniently manage them with Visual Studio Code in the same editor window. To achieve this, we can again go to File and then choose Open Folder. On macOS, this option doesn't exist. There, instead, it's again the Open option. On macOS, you use Open for both files and folders. On Windows, you have separate options. So here I choose Open Folder on Windows. And now I select the entire folder, which contains my index.html file. Now, when you open that entire folder, you might again get that trust warning, where you again, of course, can simply confirm it and click Open. And once you selected that folder, you will see that the interface changes a bit. Now here on the left, we have a list of all the files in that folder. At the moment, that's only one file, but soon we'll have more files in here. And you can click on those files to then open and edit them here on the right. Now that's how you can open a folder with Visual Studio Code, and that's the mode with which will work throughout this course. Of course, both on Windows and macOS. Now, before we start working on that code again, let's talk about the configuration of Visual Studio Code and the look I have here. As you can tell, I have a dark mode here, and you might have that same look. If you don't and you want it, or if you have it and you don't want it, you can go to Code, Preferences, and then there to Color Theme. And there you can then pick a different color theme. And if you select them with the arrow keys, you get a preview instantly. Now I will switch to this dark plus theme, but you can of course use any theme you want. You can also explore the settings here and the shortcuts, though to get started there is nothing special that would need to be configured. I will zoom in a bit here though to make sure that you can read this code a bit better. And I will also often disable this bar on the left since it takes up a lot of space and currently we have only one file anyways. And I'll do that with View, and then there, under Appearance, I can disable this sidebar. And here you can also control whether you have a status bar at the bottom, for example, and a couple of other things. Simply play around with that and make sure you configure the editor such that you personally like it. I will try to go for a minimal approach here for the most part to make it easy for you to follow along. And therefore I'll, for example, also disable breadcrumbs, which was this part above the code, to really have this lean setup here. So now we got this editor set up. And it's this editor which we're going to use for the entire course. You can use other editors as well. There are alternatives like Sublime Text or Atom. But my strong recommendation is using Visual Studio Code unless you have a personal favorite already and you know that you prefer some other editor. We're also going to tweak this editor here from time to time throughout the course. We're going to install certain extensions to help us with certain aspects. We might dive into the settings. But to get started, we now got everything which we need, and therefore let's move on.